Welcome to the Manumission podcast, the show dedicated to unshackling ourselves from the status quo. Here's your host, H.H. Morris.
Hello, my pretties. Welcome to another episode of the Manumission podcast. Today, I want to discuss the controversial topic of immigration. This has been kind of in the headlines one way or the other for a long time, especially here in the United States. Over the last few years, it's been a big topic in places like Europe as well, and I'm going to go through some of the reasons why that is, and kind of look at both sides of the issue here, the open borders arguments, the closed border arguments. What can we make of those? Is there a way that we can find some middle ground or completely blow up both sides and come up with something completely different? I think if we look at it through the lens of freedom and liberty, there's a few things that we can come up with that would probably work out for the best. And I'm talking about for most people, while also being consistent with the things that we've discussed about in the past in terms of natural rights and, individual liberty, that kind of stuff. All right. So let's get started. Well, first of all, like I mentioned, immigration, I'm going to give you just kind of the three main reasons why this has been a big contention here in the last few years. And they're all kind of intertwined, but I kind of broke them up in three. Now, this has always been an issue for countries like, for instance, the U.S., where I live and where I'm an immigrant to this country. And it's always been a topic of contention. It's always been a topic for debate. And in Europe, however, hasn't been that much of an issue. And for the most part, especially in the Eurozone, all that stuff, have had open borders between themselves, between the different EU members and all that kind of stuff. But it kind of came to a head in Europe a couple of years ago with the beginning of a refugee crisis stemming from the Syrian conflict. All right, so they started getting a lot of people that were coming through in boats that were coming through Turkey and into the European continent, and they were starting to, trying to manage what to do with a lot of these people. Do they just put them in camps? They started essentially sending them off to different countries, the UK, Germany, parts of Scandinavia, and so on and so forth. And that started creating a lot of tension, a lot of issues within those countries. And so that kind of became a very heated topic for the Europeans, whereas here, like I mentioned before, in the United States, it's always been a topic of conversation. Just for as far back as we can think, it's always been an issue. Well, let me change that. Not as far back as we can think, because if you think about it, early 20th century up into probably even the 50s, immigration wasn't even that big of an issue. Immigration was looked at just the norm, and most of the people that came here came in the early 20th centuries. If you remember, or you think of like the Ellis Island and people coming in and through boats and checking in and starting a new life, and these were mostly European, either from Western Europe or even Eastern Europe. The Italians, and we had the Irish, you had the Poles, and a whole bunch of people, and that wasn't a big deal, right? It wasn't probably until the mid-'60s when the policy of European immigration kind of took a backseat to the immigrants from Mexico, Central, and South America. That I think that's where kind of it started going sideways, because you were now talking about a much different, not too much different, but definitely different culture, different people coming in. And that's probably been what has kept this thing going since then. So I was wrong about that's always been an issue. But nonetheless, so we have the refugee crisis that kind of spurred the issue in Europe. Like I said, it's been an issue for a long time in the United States. And obviously, that kind of, in terms of Europe, that came to a head with Brexit. So when people were deciding whether they were going to leave the European Union or not, this was a huge topic because people were sick of the the bureaucrats and unelected bureaucrats in Brussels telling them, hey, you're going to take these many people, whether you like it or not. That's just the rules. You do as we tell you. Obviously, there's a lot of economic issues involved there, but since we're only dealing with immigration today, I just wanted to point out that was a big factor. And then obviously, the issue in Syria was also something that the United States had to contend with, because they were also, Obama and his administration was also bringing people in, refugees into the country. I think there's been somewhere about around 1 million people that have been brought over from Syria that were refugees from that war. And and I believe that Hillary had plans to bring in another close to 1 million people. I believe it was like 800,000 people or whatever. So obviously this was something that was discussed during the campaigns, and Trump was dead set against it, right? The other kind of different flashpoints in terms of this even being brought up so heatedly in the campaigns was the fact that there were some terrorists acts of terrorism across the United States, and that kind of made everybody think back or step back and say, hey, should we be bringing people in from countries where we're essentially at war with, right? And a lot of people were of the mind that, it doesn't make a lot of sense that if we are essentially at war, I mean, no one can deny that essentially the U.S. is at war in Syria, even though they don't want to say that. They've essentially been in northern Iraq and in Syria, fomenting a lot of the issues that are going on there, because they've wanted regime change and get al-Assad out of there, and that's resulted in a lot of death and destruction. So obviously, a lot of people are going to need to get the hell out of there. So that's how it's kind of been part of the political milieu in the last year or so. And this is also one of the things that has divided a lot of people. And I believe that especially in the libertarian camp. I think that both the left and the right have been pretty consistent in this topic across the board and throughout the last few decades. I haven't seen a lot of change in the way that people address this. And it's been in the libertarian community where I've seen this completely just divide people, right down the middle. Okay, and I'll go through some of that as well, because it's in the libertarian divide that we see both arguments more clearly, I think. So we'll see what that looks like in a minute. So, okay, so what are the current positions out there? So let's start with the open borders camp. And let's start with the left. So the left essentially is for open borders. That's what they claim. They're fine with people just coming in to the country in and out. And I'm going to make some distinctions here and there as I go along between maybe what's going on in Europe and the U.S., but we're mostly going to stick with the U.S. here because a lot of the stuff that I say kind of applies there too. If there are a few things that need some distinctions outlined, I will. But for the most part, let's talk about the U.S. Okay, so the left tends to be for open borders. All right, now. So what are their justifications for the fact that people should be able to just come into a country willy-nilly and do as they please? Go and get jobs, do whatever it is that they need. All right. So their justifications for most of the time, most often, is just sheer and simple human rights. Okay. So people should be allowed to live with dignity. If they come into a place, another country, wherever, they should be allowed to stay and be able to work and do whatever it is that they need to do to survive and all that stuff. All right. And then also just kind of going hand in hand with that is it's just being compassionate for other people in need. So whether it's people that are escaping war, or whether it's just, poverty that they're escaping, or oppression or whatever, that it's important for a country to be compassionate to those people, bring them in, and let them have a shot at a better life. All right. Now, I'm going to try to do these value free. I just want to try to get through to you what it is that these people are saying, at least in try to get in their mind and how they see themselves and how they come across, or what they're trying to put across, without me kind of trying to editorialize here. So then there's also, in terms of the open borders crowd, there's also libertarians in there. And the libertarians, the justifications for open borders in terms of libertarians is that they say that that is the only consistent application of the non-aggression principle, which we've discussed a couple of episodes ago, and we talked about how when we're dealing with basic rights, which are basically grounded upon property rights, that the non-aggression principle is kind of the way that we codify that. And so the right to, freely travel is part of that, right? Because if you're stopping me from going where I'm going, where I want to go, and live the way I want to live, and be able to work where I want to work and all that stuff, then you're essentially aggressing against me, right? So if we're going to be consistent with the non-aggression principle, then a principled libertarian would have to be for open borders. All right, so that's that's the main thrust of their argument and their main argument. Now there are some, especially that are left libertarians, that do get on the compassion thing type of bandwagon with the traditional leftists, but that's not as big of an issue. I mean, they focus more on the non-aggression principle and being consistent with that. But in a lot of those do tend to also bring up the fact that, hey, we can't be heartless. We need to open our hearts and our arms to people in need and blah, blah, blah. Right. But that's just kind of, icing on the cake. It's not their main argument. All right. So then what about the closed borders crowd? So let's start with the right. And when I talk about the right, here I'm talking about the alt-right, the new right, the paleo-conservatives, and even all the way down to like full-on national socialists like Nazis, like KKK type folk, all right? And I'm going to talk later, I'm going to kind of disambiguate between these groups and the mainstream like Republican establishment, because that's also very different. But I'll talk about that, then you'll see where I'm going with this when I get there. But so you guys understand, the alt-right is not the same thing as the new right. So the alt-right are basically nationalists that are all about demographics, all about ethnicities and all that kind of stuff, but also wanting to. These are the a fringe of conservatives, not too far into the alt-right kind of coming together, and it brought in a big group of people. Now they've kind of splintered between the alt-right and the new right, because the alt-right ended up being a lot more nationalistic and even national socialist in some ways, that a lot of people were like, oh yeah, no, this isn't what we thought it was, and they're kind of jumped ship since, and they now consider themselves the new right. And they say new right because instead of neocons, because they're all about America first, not necessarily very religious or anything like that, but they do appreciate and think that preserving Western values and American culture is important and all that kind of stuff. All right. Then you have the paleos, which are, we've talked about that in the previous. So we have a lot of the old right type guys and all that kind of stuff. And then again, the full on National Socialists, right? The Nazis, those kind of folks. These are a very, very fringe minority. Now, the left, especially the mainstream media, will make you believe that the alt-right and the full-on Nazi folk are, the majority, if not at least half of what makes up the right. And they're absolutely full of it. I mean, there's nothing to that. You've probably seen a lot of things out from the mainstream media about some of these fringe groups that definitely have, they're definitely out there. They exist. I actually follow a lot of these people. I do it so that you don't have to, so that I can kind of report to you, what's going on out there, and I can differentiate between what it is that the vast majority of the right is saying, as opposed to what a kooky fringe is saying. Okay, that's important as it is to know what it is that the left, the big bulk of the left is saying, and what the extremes are saying. All right. So essentially, the thrust of the closed borders argument is that no one should be able to enter into the country without permission. All right, that's a very simple way to put it. I mean, you don't have to make it into a very complicated issue. They're essentially just saying, hey, just like in your house, no one should be able to enter your house without knocking, without asking for permission, or you inviting them in. All right. Now the left, so not necessarily just the left, just the open borders crowd will characterize this group as if what they're saying is, none shall enter. And that's not the case. I mean, a lot of the people, most of the people in this crowd understand that you need to be able to let people in and out. I mean, that's part of freedom. That's part of commerce. That's part of a lot of things. So very few people, I mean, I haven't even heard of one, maybe the full-on Nazi guys that I've mentioned before are to the point that they say no one should ever enter ever again and just leave everybody out. But I mean, even that would be silly. So I mean, basically economic suicide, right? I think most people understand that. All right, so what are their justifications? So I broke them out between the three main justifications for this, and they're economic, cultural, and nationalistic or ethnic. All right, so economic. And this is probably the biggest one. This is the big bulk of right-wingers will understand that economics is at play here, right? And they'll say, well, you can't have both a welfare state and open borders, right? Because then what happens is then you're incentivizing people to come over here and they can get on welfare, right? They're basically just going to be parasites on the system. And so if they're coming in, they've never paid into this system, right? Because they've been some other country, and then they just walk across or whatever it is, and then they're suddenly going to public schools. Their kids are going to public schools. They're going to the emergency room to be seen by a doctor or whatnot. They don't end up paying, so it has to be paid by Medicaid or whatever it is. Then obviously you have an economic problem here, and also the fact that they come in and they take jobs that Americans would have taken or could have taken. All right, so that's the main thrust. That's probably the largest one. Now, there's also kind of one step down from that is the cultural justification that also kind of permeates across probably all of these groups to some degree, is that you are bringing, especially when you're talking about the immigration from third world countries, countries where they're from cultures that are very different from American culture and Western culture in general. And so, well, what's happening is you're going to have these issues between communities where they don't assimilate. There's going to be all this misunderstanding. A lot of people don't learn the language. They don't learn the customs. They refuse to in some cases. And then you basically are left with chaos. And so that just doesn't work in the long run. And then another step down from that is the nationalistic ethnic justification. And again, that goes more towards the alt-right folks and the even all the way down to the full-on Nazis, KKK guys, which is they could care less about the economic aspect or even culture. I mean, culture is still an issue, but to them, it's about this is a white nation. This is what we want to preserve. Again, it also, that also applies to the cultural type of argument. And that is basically what we want to do. We want to make sure that we maintain the United States as a white, Protestant, Western culture and society. All right. So, I mean, right, just from me saying that, I think you could see a lot of problems with that, which is that's obviously very, very small-minded, and it's actually very silly in a lot of respects, because if you're saying that if that's your main justification for closing the borders, then that means that for you, all that matters is that you don't get, I don't know, brown people in your country, right, or Muslims or whatever, and that even if they happen to be PhDs in aeronautical and aerospace engineering or whatever, that you'd still just rather have some ignorant 65 IQ white person in your society over someone that just looks different than you, just because they just happen to be your same race. So I think everybody can see how silly that is. That's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But suffice it to say that exists out there, that is out there. And albeit it's a very fringe side of the right. Okay. Now, what about the libertarians who are on the closed borders side of things? Because this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, or not necessarily complicated, but much more nuanced than the right's arguments, which seem to be a little simplistic, at least in my opinion. So the libertarians that are for closed borders, and even then, even by saying that, I'm not being completely fair to them, because libertarians say, it's not that I'm for closed borders, I'm for private property rights. And the problem is that we don't live in a free society where everything is privatized, and that basically whoever owns a piece of land can say, hey, no, you can't come in here, or yeah, come on in, right? So the problem with them is that they say the current state of things with the modern nation state is that a state's borders create a kind of pseudo private property conditions, right? So they create this type of situation where you're kind of in limbo, where the state says that it basically controls everything inside of its borders, and that is kind of the equivalent of the walls in your house. So they should be able to say, not even should, they do say what, who comes in and who doesn't, right? So, okay, so let me see if I can kind of clarify that point, because it's not very, very obvious if you haven't studied some of this stuff. All right, so I mentioned Hans Hermann Hoppe in one of the previous episodes. It might have been the previous one. And he brings up a point in one of his books, Democracy, the God That Failed, which I recommend for everybody. And he essentially shows how this kind of stuff is very straightforward when you're looking at monarchies, right? Because if a king basically says, I own all of this land, right, this kingdom, you essentially have a private property condition, right? The sovereign, the monarch, is saying, this is essentially my land, no different than it would be your house and the land surrounding your house, the territory that you own. And he could say, or she could say, hey, you rolling in here with your troops, that is an affront to my property rights, whatever, and I have the right to tell you not to come in or go out. And he or she, the king or queen, can kick out anybody out of their kingdom because it's their property, it's their land. And what happened with the rise of the modern nation states and these democracies is that it became very convoluted, because when you're saying that essentially, yes, the government, the state that demarcates this region, this territory as the country, but most of that area, other than the ones that they say, yes, this is state controlled. So be it, ports, be it, for instance, Washington, D.C., like they said, right, forts, ports, and 10 square miles is supposed to be the as big as the federal government can get, territory-wise or land-wise. And then everything else is either property that people buy or have homesteaded or whatever. And then the vast majority, the rest of the territory, is essentially public, what they call public or, common areas. But what the hell does that mean? I mean, if I'm part of the public, right? I'm public. I'm part of the public. Does that mean that I can go in to any area and just do whatever I want with it? No, they won't. They'd kick me out and say, hey, I'm building a house in there. No, you can't. Well, then I don't own it. So if you remember when we talked back about property rights and what it means to own something, and when you're saying, well, in order to own something, you have to have the ability or the right to, say what that property is used for or whether it's not used, and also be able to have the right to transfer ownership title to someone else, right? But I have no such ability in common areas in the country, even though supposedly I'm part owner of it. But if you apply that ownership, the definition of ownership, then you would have to conclude that it's the bureaucrat that runs it, that owns it, because he or she can say who goes in, who can't go out, what that territory is designated for, whether it's for conservation or whether it's for, whatever they say it. And if it's going to change hands, it's that bureaucrat that also decides. So technically, it's that bureaucrat that owns that piece of land, right? So it becomes very, very convoluted in when we're talking about democracy. So the libertarians are saying, and I want this to be clear, that the libertarians for closed borders, their arguments aren't as simple as the mainstream, the typical right winger, because they're saying, hey, we're all for the we're libertarians. Remember that we're all for the non-aggression principle and private property rights and all that kind of stuff. But you have to contend with the fact that as things stand right now, that doesn't apply, or we can't apply that perfectly, because none of that stuff is private. It's common areas, and as such, then we have to look at other things, right? So, all right, so let's look at some of their justifications, even though that was part of their justifications. But again, I'm going to break it down through the same ones that we discussed with the right, which are economics, culture, and nationalism. So I want to differentiate how they have some of these same ones with the right, but how they're different in their own way. In that economics, the libertarians also understand and argue the fact that you can't have both open borders and a welfare state. And they also point out that the incentive structure is completely skewed when you have that setup. Now, the way that they're different from the right when talking about the welfare state is that they realize that people coming into an area to be productive is a good thing. So whereas the typical right might say all these people coming in are all just basically sucking off of the teat of the government and they're parasites and all that stuff, libertarians realize that, hey, if you're going to be consistent, you're going to realize that these people are able to create, to start businesses, to work in places and make things, and therefore you're going to have growth, right? Moreover, when you say that people are coming in and they're taking jobs that Americans wouldn't do, for instance, that's also kind of I would say it's a mischaracterization of the problem, because what's really happening is that the welfare state is it's incentivizing a lot of Americans to not work because they're getting paid to not work, and then those jobs that they still need to be done, right? Someone still has to pick the strawberries. Someone still has to clean bathrooms and do all these things. Now, Americans opt to not do them because they're getting paid just as much, or in some cases even more, if they don't work in the way of food stamps and housing credits and Medicaid and all these other just welfare in general, right? So then what happens is, you still do need people to do that work. Well, guess what? People who are making a lot less than that in other parts of the world are going to be like, hey, I'll do that job, right? But the right is very short-sighted when it comes to that aspect. Then in cultural, there is a cultural justification in of sorts with the libertarian side, because they also recognize that if you are also just bringing in people from other parts of the world that aren't from the West, let's say, right? So they don't have a tradition, this Western tradition of liberalism, and I mean classical liberalism in the way that we talk about liberty and basic rights and all that kind of stuff. Then what's happening is you're going to get that much further from ever being able to reach an actual free society, because now you're basically just bringing in people that want the state. They want bigger, stronger government. And so then therefore you're basically just shooting yourself in the foot. Now, the other side, not other side, but an addition to that is that we also need to understand the libertarian differentiation between someone walking across a line, or swimming across a river that is this arbitrary border into, again, a common land, and just eventually making their way to a city where they find a job and all that kind of stuff. And the actual government program that is, or that can be, things like refugee programs and all that kind of stuff, where we are actually, as citizens, as taxpayers, paying for the government to go and fly, plane loads worth of people back to the United States to settle them, to house them, to feed them, to do all this stuff, give them all that stuff. Now that is a very different thing, right? Because someone walking across the desert on their own, putting their life at risk, and eventually, getting to Los Angeles or Phoenix or whatever it is and finding a job and doing all that stuff, that cost me nothing, right, as a taxpayer. So that's also very different from the fact that someone is going to be put on a bus or on a plane or whatever, and they're going to come. That's what's happening in Europe, right? So they're essentially bringing these people in. The government is paying for all of this. They're paying thousands and thousands of dollars of taxpayer money to bring these people in, put them in housing, give them welfare and all these things, and they have paid zero into this system that they're taking now thousands of dollars worth or euros worth every year, right? So we also need to recognize that there is a difference between those two forms of immigration and those two actions, right? And libertarians are also very clear about what it is that they also mean, because some of the closed borders libertarians are for, or are okay with, someone making their way into the country on their own and making what they can with what they have, and then say, but if you're talking about the actual government program of relocating people, that's a different story altogether. Even though once that person that walked across on their own, once they get into the country, they might also start using a lot of services and things that they also haven't paid for. But it is very different, because even though they're working underground and there might be, not paying taxes or whatever, they have no option. They can't get a lot of these public programs because they're not citizens, right? So they have to work and they have to pay their own way, and they end up paying society back in a lot of different ways through, they pay a ton, billions of dollars worth in sales taxes and all these other types of taxes that the other closed borders folks don't take into account. All right. So that's the kind of economic / cultural, which they're getting less and less. They're decreasing here in importance. And then the last one, again, is nationalism. And the nationalism aspect or justification isn't a very big one for libertarians, because the ones who do use that as a justification, again, talking about the ethnicity, talking about, race or that kind of stuff, the libertarians that actually, for whom that stuff does matter, have essentially broken up with libertarianism. They have gone directly to the alt-right, and they're still there, or they're still kind of like dipping their toes in the water over there. So in terms of your run-of-the-mill libertarianism, the nationalistic aspect is not, is not a big argument for them. All right. Now, I left out another group that I wanted to also mention, and for people to realize that why it's different, because it's not very clear, it's not very obvious to people. But when I discuss the left, basically I'm discussing also the Democratic Party, with the open borders and the compassion. At least they say they're compassionate, and it's mostly virtue signaling, and they tend to be for open borders. Now there are some exceptions to that, but they're very, very small. Like, for instance, there are some Democrats in some parts of the country where they might pay lip service to having some sort of border controls and immigration controls and all that stuff. And that's usually in areas where their constituents are big, union people, right? Because unions also aren't very big into illegal immigration or even immigration in general, because that suppresses their wages, because these people are willing to work for such little money that you could hire 2 or 3 of them instead of one union worker, right? So when you do see Democrats kind of talking or at least not supporting open borders outright, that's usually the case. But again, that's probably a very small minority. Now, on the right, the difference is that we can't just say Republicans, because the actual Republicans in power have a very different view from the mainstream right. Like I said, the mainstream right, they're mostly for closed borders, or at least against illegal immigration, whereas the establishment Republicans are I'm very wishy-washy on this. And they basically say, no, we have to have some path to citizenship, and we have to have all these programs, all these different hurdles that people need to jump through, but people need to have a way to get, citizenship or, permanent residency or whatever it is. Now, I think it's important to know that, because when I'm talking about the right, don't assume that that is what the Republicans are going to be saying or what they're saying in the arguments that they're making, because they're not. They're very out of touch with the mainstream right on this. So how can we explain this? Well, the way you explain this is that those people, again, being establishment, they're beholden to big business. And so, and they are aware of their need for cheap labor. Okay, so they kind of have to toe this line between, we know that our constituents, for the most part, are against illegal immigration, but we also have to, basically appease our donors and the people that give us all the money to be in power, and their need for cheap labor and ever decreasing wages and that kind of stuff, right? So I hope that kind of makes sense to you guys as to why that there is such a difference there between the mainstream right and the constituency, as opposed to the actual politicians. All right. So how can we bridge this divide, or what can we do? Because I think we can all agree that there is an issue, right? So there's an issue of people suffering and needing to go elsewhere to have a better life for themselves. We know that there is an issue in terms of a welfare state that's unsustainable, and the actual cultural and demographic issues that go along with a vastly heterogeneous societies and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think we can all agree that all of those conditions exist. All right. So here's some of my solutions when I look at things through my lens of freedom, of liberty. And I always try to default to, can we solve, this problem with freedom, right? And so some of the things that I've come up with are, we always have to change the incentive structure for us to be able to change something in the long run. Okay? Because if we build a wall, if all you do is build a wall, that's going to hold people back to a degree, right? But just as we know that we all have doors and we all have walls around our houses, there are still burglaries, right? That doesn't stop it. It might make it a lot more difficult for someone, and especially someone that's not that motivated, that'll probably keep them away. But someone that's motivated, that needs it, if there is a demand, that the supply will come, and we know this, and even the right wingers know this very well, right? I mean, look at the left wingers first. So they're very aware when it comes to something like the war on drugs, that as long as there is a demand, the supply is going to come one way or the other. So they might as well either decriminalize it or legalize it or whatever, and take the profit motive and the violence aspect out of it, and at least be able to keep people out of jail and have this huge war that's costing so many lives and trillions of dollars now, since what it was in 1976 or whatever that the war on drugs was declared. That's really not done anything. Why? Because the demand is there. So the left understands that very well when it comes to the war on drugs, and the right just refuses to believe that when it comes to the war on drugs. And we need to look at it in a similar fashion when it comes to immigration, right? Because what are the incentives? So let me start with the refugee problem, because those are two different aspects, right? We were talking about the refugees, so people fleeing from a war zone or something like that, and the other was just people walking across, and they tend to be from countries that are poor or whatever. So the incentive structure, right, that we need to address when it comes to the refugee issue in places like Europe, and like I mentioned before, it's still an issue in the U.S. because the government still wants to bring some of these refugees to the United States, but again, the biggest brunt is being felt by Europe. So what do? Well, the number one thing is, if we're going to address the demand, right, is the ending the wars. So that's step number one. If you have to end the wars in these places, so that there is no demand to get out of those countries, right? Which gives you the supply of refugees. That's how you get your supply of refugees, with the demand to get the hell out of Dodge when bombs are falling on top of you, right? So that's number one. And in order to make that stick, we need to do away with foreign interventionism. I mean, there's just no way that we can resolve this issue in the long term unless people stop, I don't want to say people, I'm sorry, states, governments stop, unless governments stop meddling in other countries. So especially Western countries, the US, UK, all those countries that are constantly getting involved in the Middle East and in other parts of the world where they're trying to establish, friendlier regimes and that kind of stuff. But that's exactly what drives this supply of refugees, when that happens, with all the collateral damage that results from that military intervention. Okay, and again, along the same lines is these countries need to stop empire building, right? So trying to bring in these different parts of the world into their own into the fold, and again, which results in the same thing. So you have to attack the demand. If there's no demand to leaving your country, there's no supply of immigrants or refugees, right? And so this is a similar type of situation with the poverty refugees, if you will, these are the ones that are coming into the United States, at least from Mexico, Central and South America. These are people that are basically leaving their countries to find a better life in the United States, right? So again, you have to deal with the demand. Now, you can do the demand in your own country. That's more easily done. And like I mentioned before, the best, or one of the best ways, is by ending the welfare state. Because if they know that, they're not going to come in and just be able to, plug right into the welfare state, that will probably make them think twice, right? But again, like I also mentioned, which the libertarians do point out, that it actually doesn't work that way, because it's not that many illegal immigrants that are getting access to welfare programs, because they don't qualify, right? Even though some kind of find loopholes, and obviously the government isn't very very effective at its job, so a lot of things fall through the cracks. But the vast majority, since they don't qualify, they don't use those programs. So the other side, what happens is, when you do end the welfare state, though, is that then you incentivize all of the people inside the country, the ones that are citizens, to work. And so then once you have all of those jobs spoken for, then you're going to decrease the demand or the need for jobs and new people to fill them, which means that then what are they going to come to the U.S. for, right? So they say, okay, I need to get out of here. I need to get out of Mexico because it sucks down here, but I know if I go to the U.S., there aren't any jobs out there, and there's no welfare state that I could plug into for them to give me, housing or whatever, or my kids won't go to school, whatever, so I might as well, stay here. And that is the, again, when we're talking about the demand, that's exactly the key. Because you might be thinking, well, you haven't done anything to solve the problems for those people, right? So you're just a heartless bigot that these people aren't now just going to stay in their countries. But guess what? It's the fact that all of these people who are hurting and leaving their countries that has served as a pressure valve for their governments to get away with their shitty governments. Okay? So I hope you guys understand what I'm saying here. That it's because, millions of Mexicans and millions of Central American and South American people make their way out of those countries, that those governments never reach a tipping point, right? So whether it's, falling into outright revolution, or whether it's people taking to the streets and protesting, whether it's whatever it is that needs to happen for those governments to get their acts together, it never happens because of that pressure valve that is the United States. All right? So if all of these people are, you imagine who benefits the most from these poor people in countries like Latin America. Who benefits the most for the poorest of the poor to leave that country? The government, right? They don't have to worry about paying for their bills. They don't have to worry about them going to their public healthcare systems. They don't have to worry about their housing. They don't have to worry about feeding them. They don't have to worry about them rioting or picketing or taking to arms, right? So no one benefits more than the governments of those crappy countries. And what needs to happen is that those countries need to finally be taken to task. The only way that's going to happen, the only way that they're going to reach that tipping point, is when those people have no choice but to change the situations in their own countries. And that's why I take this kind of different approach than a lot of libertarians, and even me as an immigrant. My country of origin is Mexico. I came here when I was young, but I travel a lot back to, all my friends and family are still back there, and I travel there a lot. And one of the things that pisses me off the most when I hear, including other Mexicans, that say, oh, those damn Americans, they're racist, and they treat us Mexicans like crap and all that kind of stuff, and they start, basically talking down about the U.S., and they say, aren't you more embarrassed about the fact that your fellow countrymen have to risk their lives leaving your own country? Like, wouldn't that be more of a priority for you to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to make it so that I change things in this country, so that, because if you really do believe that the vast majority of Americans, which unfortunately, this is the case. This is the common belief in, at least I can speak for Mexico, that Americans are racist and they are bigots and they basically abuse, Hispanics, right? Which is absolutely ridiculous. And me being here and living here, I know exactly how it works, but they also have the same issues that we have here in terms of a really corrupt media, yellow journalism up the yin yang. It's just terrible. I mean, if you think it's bad here, just watch some news channels, cable news channels in Mexico or other parts of Latin America. They're absolutely horrible. And so my point is that I want those countries that are terrible to actually, that's where you actually get the change. Because if you're only helping, just look at the left, right? Let's look at the left. They're so big-hearted, so compassionate, and they're saying that if we need to help out these million people to have a better life and to have a shot, and they're so magnanimous, so big-hearted. By the way, they don't pay for it themselves, right? They want everybody else to pay for it. But let's take them at their word that they care so much. But when do you hear them talking about the terrible conditions in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, you name it, right? The people there, for the most part, are poor. And you're talking about not a million people, for whom they think they're defending here, the immigrants, right? The million immigrants that come here a year or whatever it is. There's another 500 million down there that are in worse conditions. So why don't they talk about those people, right? Because ultimately, when it comes to the left, what they want is not that they care about these people. What they want is votes. And believe me, if these immigrants didn't tend to vote Democrat, they would have put a dome around the country already. All right? And the case in point here, the only group of immigrants that votes Republican are Cubans. And just a couple of days ago, Obama just ended the policy of Cuban immigrants basically being accepted in as refugees as soon as they basically set foot on land. Right? So he did away with that policy. Is it a coincidence that it's the only group of Hispanics that votes for Republicans over Democrats? Of course not. So the left are full of it. They don't care about people. They're not compassionate. Not only are they not the ones paying for all this stuff, they are never, ever vocal about the countries of origin of these people and the fact that that's where the change needs to happen. All they want are votes. Okay? So if we actually want to do something that matters, is do away with the welfare state in the United States. Get Americans, all Americans, back to work and fill up all those jobs, which means that you're going to do away with the incentives of other people wanting to come from other countries, which means that that's going to lead to those people having to change their circumstances in their own countries, which is going to make it so that we have a better world all around, not just in America. Okay? So I hope that's a little different from what you've heard out there, and that you kind of understand the arguments a little better. It's a complicated, convoluted topic, but I think it's one that's very interesting and worthwhile discussing. And next episode, I'm going to kind of turn up the dial in terms of controversy, in that I want to address something that's also a very big point of contention, not just among the left and the right, but even within libertarian circles. And that is the topic of IQ. I'll see you then. If you want to know how you can help me keep the show going, or if you have a question, comment, or recommendation, you can contact me directly or through social media. Find out how to do all that by visiting manumission.com.